everybody, and welcome back to the third episode of The Cup, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I am the panel host, once again, Mackenzie, and this week we have some very special guests joining us. We have returning guest and friend of the company, Ms. Jill. Jill, how are you?
Hello, I'm well. How are you, Mac?
I'm doing very well. What is in your cup today?
Okay, so as you all know, there's a theme. I theme my drink and I theme my earrings to these things.
Okay,
so, of course, I have a giant goblet of red wine just to resemble all the blood and lust in this show. And then I have Hamza hands on as my earrings. And in all faiths, it's a symbol of protective and happiness and against the evil eye. So I noticed we have a witch with us today, so I needed to make sure I'm on guard.
Fantastic. And we have a very special guest. We have Ms. Brigit Wilson coming at us from the Stratford Festival. She also performed in the production we'll be talking about today as the first witch. And I've had the privilege of working with Brigit. So Brigit, hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me. I am drinking wine tonight.
Oh, fantastic.
Ooh, okay.
I'm remembering from the film when he says, more wine, filled full.
Perfect. Wonderful. I love it. And then last but certainly not least, we are joined by our artistic director of Cup of Hemlock, Mr. William Bartley. Hello, Will.
Hey, Mac. How's it going?
It's going. I'm so happy to have you on for your first episode of The Cup. I'm sure there'll be.
Yeah, it's finally happening.
Yes, exactly. We've got you here. The witches were kind today. There were no Wi-Fi problems. No curses were laid upon your house today. You were good and ready to join us.
Yes, fortunately. Yeah, and I guess I'm supposed to say what I'm drinking.
Absolutely.
It's funny. Normally on these recorded sessions, I am having a drink with Jill, and this is the first time probably I'm having a cup of Nepal black smoked tea in a Shakespeare mug.
Very nice.
Because at the dark, brooding elements of this play, I'm going to go with the fact that I chose this intentionally. And
yes.
Definitely making something on the spot.
Love it. I love it. And because this play was set in the 11th century, I pulled out my daily work mug from the office, my medieval times tankard, as our castle that I work in is also 11th century. So I thought, what a perfect little time period thing to have. So why don't we kick things off with talking about curses and superstitions, as this play is rife with them. Some people refuse, as theater people, we will not say the name of this play in a theater. There are ways to counteract the curse, but this is most certainly something that is very prevalent when you're working on this play. So, Brigit, as you've performed in this play and worked on it, why don't you kind of kick us off with what are your thoughts about curses and superstitions associated with this work?
I totally believe in them. This production that we did at Stratford started and ended pretty badly. I think in terms of research, we discovered that the witch's words were based. There is a particular curse in the production, in the play, which they feel Shakespeare did actually have knowledge was real. And that is around the lines about thrice to thine. And even now, I don't want to continue saying those lines because what we felt as the three witches, and the number 3 is very important in a lot of his plays. We felt as actors the power of when we came together and held each other and said those lines. So I believe that the authentic curse is within that scene. But I will say that, our production started off pretty badly. We had a lady Macbeth who came in a cast because she'd broken an ankle. So that didn't start us off on the right foot. We had numerous injuries during it. We filmed the production, which you watched this past week. And about 2 performances after the filming, our Mackers tore his Achilles tendon and was on really like on crutches for 9 months afterward.
Wow.
His understudy was prepped. The understudy went on then they were prepping an understudy for the understudy, and the fella that took over the part, he lost his voice, so his understudy went on without actually rehearsing the entire play.
Wow.
So it just it continued to just snowball.
Yeah.
So and our production is not unusual. Like that was not an unusual scenario. We did one many years ago here at Stratford, and it was a game changer in terms of health and safety in Canada and in the arts, because we had, I believe, the actress too was playing one of the witches. I could be wrong about that, but she was a senior company member, and she took a step backstage off the balcony. She went not down the stairs, but straight to the floor.
Oh.
And so she was basically in a coma. She did recover, and I did work with her. She was a wonderful actress, Joyce Campion.
Yeah.
But it began to change just the color of the water in Canadian theater history. We then found ourselves with health and safety experts, and the health and safety at Stratford was ramped up.
Nice.
Wow, that is incredible. That's whew. Ooh, that actually gave me some of those chills just thinking about this.
Yeah, me too.
Falling off that balcony. Just oh wow. Jill, how about you? What are your thoughts about superstitions and curses?
Yeah, so similar to Brigit, just as a person, when I watch horror films, which I like to treat myself to every once in a while, but I find my brain, it's branded on my brain forever. So, and paranormal activity stuff really gets under my skin, and I could probably relate to you, like those movies like the back of my hand, unfortunately. So that kind of stuff, I'm not like married to believing, but I definitely feel it exists. And as someone, as a person, I read energies really well, and so that definitely has an effect on me too. And being a performer, absolutely. So I haven't actually had the privilege of working on this piece yet, but I know I will have to have many of my own little routines in play to make sure my brain doesn't get spooked. But it's funny, I 100% I say Mackers in every theater. I don't get terribly mad if someone doesn't do that rule, but I find I always say Mackers when I'm talking about it. Very rarely will I'll say it now, but Macbeth. I say that, I guess, more in an academic sense if we're talking about like close reading a passage or whatever, but even the character itself, I usually say Lady M and Mackers. Maybe that's subconsciously my brain wanting to just like stay away.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my experience with that.
Fantastic. Will, how about you?
Well, to be frank, I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum on that matter in terms of superstitions and curses. Now, that said, I still find myself not being quite bold enough to say the name in theaters. I do say it in casual passing in a conversation, especially in the academic scope. But yes, beyond that, like, and not in a way to in a doubt of other people's experiences with it, because I'm sure if I work on the play one day, I'll probably have experiences of my own in terms of the tragedies that befall cast and crew members of the show. But I think there is something to be said about the psychological scope of believing in a superstition and a curse, and that subconsciously playing a part in how we interact with the world around us. It's not unheard of, and I think it's the other end of the spectrum. Not to say that's where I reside, but I can see the validity of that side of the argument too.
And for me, I will say I absolutely believe there is some superstitions and curses behind it. Like even in my grade 11 English class where we studied this play, we had two students up performing the after banquet scene with Lady M and Mackers. And the actor playing Mackers actually fainted mid-scene and smacked his head off a desk. Just totally blacked out, like no reason, like healthy as a horse. And he just totally dropped like a pin. And it was one of those moments where we all looked at it and went, is this part of the scene? Like, did he just have a moment? Like is he doing something in character? And then the female student was like, no, this is a serious physical thing that happen. So they literally brought in the wheelchair, and the principals all came in. We all had to leave the class. Like that was a whole thing. When I was doing directing and teaching summer camps, I like one of my things I would always teach the kids about is just fun little superstitions and things like that about the theater, because I was working with the younger kids. So I had one group that we were doing like just a regular fun murder mystery play, and I taught them this, and they all thought it was very funny to say the name in the theater. But I actually brought salt into in my bag, and I made them all go outside, do the spin around, spit, throw the salt, do their version of swearing, and I brought them all back in. I was very serious, and actually the one kid actually got some type of bug and wasn't able to perform on the Friday show. So there you go. There is something magical about this play that even when you're not even performing and you just say the name in the theater, there's something about this play that just kind of invites some type of otherworldly spirit. And it could be psychological too, where there's just something about that idea of when you're thinking something may happen and you're open to that kind of world, that maybe that's just inviting things to happen. It's almost like saying, I don't want to get a pimple, and then you get a pimple. Going, now I just said that, I'm going to get one. But that same type of, you think it can happen. And so if you're thinking, oh, something bad may happen because of this, well, then there you go. Something that may actually happen. But I don't know. Personally, I'm more on the superstitious side. I will, like, even I'm reading through all my notes again, and I wrote Lady M and M, or M does, or my thoughts. So I never typed out his whole name. The only time I ever typed it out was in our first question we're going to get to, where I was typing the title of the play. Rather than that, it's when I'm referring to characters, it was Lady M or M. That was it for me. So, yeah.
You know, funny enough too, actually, I don't think I used his name once, so maybe I am a little bit superstitious.
There's something.
I used it a lot. Oh no.
Just watch. The ceiling's just gonna right on top of you.
Mac.
you got your special earrings. You're okay.
Exactly.
Not Friday the 13th, is it?
No,
we're not
close to.
It is the 15th. Yeah, there are certain words and phrases in theater that we just don't do. It's like never saying good luck on opening night. Mind you, there's more of a historical reason for that, and that ties more back with saying Brickley, because that was the Elizabethan way to bow, where you would bow a certain way and it would look like you broke your leg. So that's a different thing. But superstitions, we're all about that in theater, which I love. It's part of that communal connection. We all have it in this community. So yeah, okay. All right, let's get into our first kind of discussion question. And it kind of goes with the way this play is interpreted. So the last time this was done before your production, Brigit, if I remember correctly, it was done with Comfior and directed by Des McAnuff. I remember seeing that, and it was very modern. Like, it had a Jeep come out on stage. There were machine guns, machete fights. It was a very modern interpretation, and was set. I do watch the trailers, and it was set in Africa, of all places, which I thought was interesting. I have to go back and read my notes on when I saw it. But with that being said, compared to your show, which was much more like traditional Highlands Scottish roots with the nature in the 11th century, which do you think is a better setting for this play, and why do you think that? Jill, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, I guess just to kick it off, one of my main points in my notes was to talk about this production, and it basically being like I was watching it at the Globe, or it was, the ground was dirt and mossy, the levels were even that the set pieces, running in with little sheaths of tree and then having that scurry off. Like, I felt like I was transported back to being, in the pits watching this happen during Shakespeare's time. So, and as someone who has only really approached this text through studying it in high school and also in theater school too, this was my first full production of seeing it, and I really enjoyed that I saw this version, because I think we usually get to this later in the discussion, Mac, but I think this is a really good first presentation of the show as it was written. And so I guess in my opinion, because this story, to me, it's not as layered as a lot of other Shakespeare plots, in my opinion. It's pretty straightforward for me as it goes through, and it's very hyper focused on Mackers throughout the whole thing. I think there is something to just setting it the way that this version was set, and just telling the story as opposed to putting layers on. I didn't get a chance to see the one starring Comfiore, but I'm sure that would also be an interesting take on it too.
It was.
But I like this Shakespeare. I like a lot of Shakespeare's, for for the sheer plot factor, and I like a lot of Shakespeare's for the sheer what can we do with it dramaturgically and directorially, and this one is more of like the plot base. So I'm gonna have to say this version is my more preferred. Whereas for Coriolanus last week, that sort of modern interpretation of that text that fit my fancy. So it just depends on what we're studying, I think, or what we're viewing. Yeah.
Brigit, what do you think? Because I'm sure you saw the Comfior version when it was there when we had that season.
I did. What I took away from it, and I do in a lot of Shakespeare, when we put it in modern time with people with AK-47s and modern weaponry, is it sort of takes me out of the play, and I don't really know how to describe that, except that a lot of the lines don't make sense. What you have to do, and I don't remember a lot about it. I'd have to go back and look at the cuts that Des McAnuff made. But you'd have to do some serious cuts the way that Robert Lepage cut and moved chunks of text around and took stuff out so that the words didn't contradict what was actually going on stage. And I think, you know, that's one of the fun things for directors, to figure out what time period to set it in. What are the brackets? How can you illuminate this text? How can you make people instantly connect? And what I remember when we were leaning into Macbeth was that that Scottish series was huge.
The Highlander?
Yes. And so there was something so sexy about thinking about all these men on stage in their kilts. Like it was kind of already create the whole sexiness of it was kind of built in. So it seemed that, you know, in terms of what was going on culturally on television, people wanted to see that again. I think, you know, the play itself is so unique within his canon that there is something about it, you know, setting it in medieval Scotland, which is, it was very sexy.
Mini snowball off that too, Brigit. Like the idea, I had so many Game of Thrones-esque moments too, you know, with like the lust of Lady M and Mackers and so many. So just another nod to sort of playing towards what's on TV, and everyone's kind of like that. There's Outlander, there's Vikings, you know, it's interesting because to me, like I said, seemed so grounded in like what this play would have been in Shakespearean time, but it's also very popular in like what's being on television today. So it was like a cool hybrid of tradition and modernity in a sense.
Yeah, very true, very true. Will, as a director, what do you feel about doing this play? Like what setting would you lean more toward if you were tackling it?
You know, it's a bit of a hard question because I definitely agree with Brigit in the sense of it being quite alienating for an audience to modernize it. I think always of the Leonardo DiCaprio Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo's father, I think, or Juliet, I can't quite remember, whichever one says, "Bring me my longsword," and he pulls out a gun, and alongside the edge of the gun is engraved longsword.
Right.
It's just one of those things that it disarms the play in a way that Macbeth in particular probably shouldn't be disarmed, being one of Shakespeare's darkest plays in my opinion. I think a lot of people's opinions. If you were going to stage this in a different setting, and I didn't know much about the Des McAnuff time setting of the piece, I haven't done a lot of research into it, but I think the setting of Africa is fantastic. If I were going to put it into a different time, it'd probably be post World War II global South countries. And a lot of the struggles that went on there between communism and capitalism in terms of leaderships that were being put out of place and into place by opposing governments of the global north, some of the more privileged countries of the world, because I think that time period encapsulates a lot of what happens within Macbeth, this power struggle, this sense of corruption, ownership, outplaying other people, and then, you know, there's very little moral consciousness that goes on within the play, and any of it is snuffed out quite quickly by other characters and other players on the world stage. So I think it's fine to stage any of Shakespeare's plays into a modern context, and Shakespeare himself took stories from the past and staged them in his own modern context. I think that there is a place for it. I just think if you're going to do it, there has to be a very clear and like strong reason to it. If you're not doing it for making a clear statement or something to be communicated or to start a conversation, say about the Bretton Woods institutions in the case of the example I'm bringing up, it doesn't hold as much water or weight. That said, like, I think Macbeth in particular, because of the mystical spiritual elements of the play, is serviced quite well to remaining in the time period that it's written for. Because by doing that, you alienate the audience in the correct way. In almost a Brechtian way, where it becomes a strange, different world for the audience members. And so they welcome the suspension of disbelief a little bit more in terms of the witches and the practices that they bring out throughout the play, and the curses and the dark forces at play that are being invited, right? So for me, if I were to stage it, definitely keep it in the time period it's in. But I wouldn't be opposed to seeing one that's staged in a different political landscape that is quite turbulent and has leaders being thrown and overthrown left, right, and center.
I'm going to...
jump right in.
Well, I'm just going to suggest that that will probably happen post this plague. I mean, that's all I'm going to say is I think that when we get on the other side of this, it's that the play Macbeth has some of the best lines that actually describe a plague-like existence, right?
Yes.
So, I think he was writing, with his finger in the water. He was living plague. He knew what it felt like. He knew what it felt like as a society. And so I think that we might be able to see a modern Macbeth just after this. Because I know what it felt like.
Agreed, sure.
Absolutely. And well, I'll piggyback off you because that's also in my notes, especially in regards to the witchcraft element. And the mysticism element, where I think this play fits better when you're dealing with that type of stuff, because the murder and revenge plots, they could be moved anywhere in time, as we saw with Coriolanus, because it's all politics and the inner machinations of that. You can move that into any time period and it will work. It's when you add in that magical element of the story where if you're more modern, people the audience are now more looking at it going, oh, I see a little bit more of myself. I see a little bit more of the world I recognize in this play. And the minute you do that, it's like, oh, but I don't believe in witchcraft. We're very much on the witchcraft side. It's much more Harry Pottery, a fantasy element versus back in the 11th centuries in that classical time period where this was a very real thing, where if you were a witch or they thought you were a witch, they could burn you or drown you or hang you for that type of thing. So I think, Will, you're absolutely right. There is that willing suspension of disbelief that is just built in with that classical time setting. I remember watching the Patrick Stewart version that he did, where it was set in like kind of Cold War Russia. And the witches were interestingly done, but at the same time, it didn't feel connected to the plot. They felt more like ethereal spirits than actually these grounded, earthbound characters that are part of this world. They were more ethereal. So yeah, Jill, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, it's almost like this piece offers the B plot to this piece of Shakespeare's work is sort of already another world in a realm. So to sort of placate a whole other era or world on the piece at hand, then you're sort of setting up like 3 tiers now, right? So I agree with what you're saying, Mac. It would take the audience almost a second glance to sort of ground themselves in what they're watching. Whereas if you see it as it's played out in this production, you are kind of tossed between these 2 different worlds already. So
perfect. Okay, fantastic. So the next question on our list that we have is, as actors and directors ourselves, what do we think, in particularly today, are the biggest challenges facing us when mounting this particular play? I mean, it is one of Shakespeare's most done plays in the canon. Like, it's right up there with the Hamlets and the Romeo and Juliets. It's studied in almost, I think, every high school. So it has a very built-in fan base where people just put it on because it's a moneymaker. People will come out and see Mackers. So, Will, why don't you start us off? What do you think is the challenge facing us as actors and directors with this piece that we have to kind of watch out for?
Yeah, I think from the actor's standpoint, the
Mhm.
easiest thing to do, and in fact, I watched the version on YouTube with the pre-show talk
Mhm.
Yes.
between the two leads and
Me
the
too, yeah.
director,
Yeah.
and I have to say is I agree very strongly with what they brought up, which is playing the mood of the piece or playing the mood of the
Yes.
character instead of
Yeah.
trying to find the grounded reality of these characters. It's so easy to look at a play like Macbeth and play it like a tragedy the whole way through. When you do that, though, you really bog down the audience and you remove them from being able to actually relate and understand these characters. And I felt silly because as I was watching the version and then I went back and I watched the pre-show talk and realized that they pretty much said the same thing. My notes kind of matched up quite well. But you know,
Love
you
when that
need
happens.
something. Yeah. You need something that contrasts that darkness, the murder, the deception, the corruption, all of these aspects, and whether that be humor, action, intimacy, something on the other end of the spectrum that allows the audience to have a little bit of a key to open the door into relating to this play, because it's an easy play to allow yourself to become too removed from. I think it's quite easy to look at some of the actions of these characters and decide like, well, you know, that's a horrible thing, and not be able to drop into that. But when you place it into the stage setting of, you know, well, you know, if this means that I can give my wife a better life, you know, that's something that I think a lot of partners can relate to. It's like, well, what if it means giving my partner the life that they've always dreamt of and wanted, right? Well, now it's not so much of a removed question, and it's something that any audience member could look at and say like, yes, I've felt that before. When you find that, I think you find the true heart of Macbeth as a play. The trick is finding that in all the characters, because it's all too easy to make Macbeth a villain throughout the whole play, to make Lady Macbeth this manipulative, you know, presence on the stage. It's all too easy to do that. You need to find the relatability as the actors.
Yeah.
The thing, just to snowball off that, Will, I did watch that interview as well, and I totally admired and understood what Kristen was saying, how a lot of her performance was rooted in love. And because Antoni had asked her the question, you know, like, how did you allow yourself to go to those places, those dark places? And she was like, love, like in the extreme groundedness in that. It sort of allowed, like you're saying, the mood of the moments to sort of just spiral out, and 100% you could see that in her relationship with everyone on stage, quite frankly. But and the switches that she made too, like the love was always there, and just allowed her to operate in that. But another thing too that I think is really interesting to this piece, and I wasn't able to watch all of The Witch's Brew, Brigit, but I loved hearing what the three of you guys had to say about the physicality that you guys did with the witches. I think especially with those characters, and everyone in this piece arguably, but an element of physicality 100% has to be explored, because it is sort of like an out-of-body experience too, right? And that those characters being grounded is totally different from Lady M and Mackers being grounded. So I think as much as absolutely mentally the mood of this piece has to be played, but I think physicality for sure has to be explored to do this psychologically safely as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And then Brigit, for you, because you performed this show twice now, because we were talking about your first experiences where you played Lady M before we started recording, but then you got to come back to this role or play later on playing the first witch. What do you think are some of the challenges that you would recommend of other actors and artists to watch out for when you're doing this play?
A long time ago, before we did this production, I'll take full credit for this thought that came into my head. Before I knew I was going to be part of it, I said, what if that witch didn't just say, look what I have, and just show you a thumb, that she actually spit it up? Now, I didn't know that was going to be me having to do that. Be careful of what you suggest.
Yeah, classic idea.
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge, not just for me personally, but for anyone doing this show, is, do you know how difficult it is to terrify a modern audience? Because that's really what this play is. It's a great, big, scary movie. So it's really difficult to make everybody be afraid. Everybody in that theater was terrified. And I think a lot of that was accomplished with the lighting and the sound. It set the mood. So we didn't have to act that. It was already in the design. But but I think if you don't go 150% of the way to the physicality, to those kinds of effects, you are going to have 1,800 people laugh at you every time.
Yeah.
If it's half done, it's just don't do it. Just go home. So there was a pressure on us this time around for me in this production to be in a world that just was terrifying. When I did my 1 hour version of the Scottish play, we couldn't bring that with us to the classrooms.
Yes.
We dealt more with the relationships. We couldn't bring the terror. We couldn't bring the nightmare. But I think that really nowadays is the most difficult thing. We've all seen all those scary movies.
Yeah.
What scares you now?
That's true.
Sorry,
no, we'll jump in. Yeah. Snowball, go.
The other thing I was going to say too is that, first of all, kudos, Brigit, to you and the whole cast, because even watching it, I was like, this is one of the craziest performances in terms of fright that was being brought out in me as a viewer, even through YouTube, right? Like the whole light, like we're going to get into this when we talk about the design. We will. Lighting elements, just like compressing the stage into these very secular focuses, like alone was a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Isolating experience. So kudos to that. The other thing I think that is an easy pitfall to fall into, just in that sense of terrifying the audience, is ramping up the energy too quickly, because this feels like a psychological terror, where it's so much more about the degeneration of these characters' minds as the play goes on, right? But if these dips happen too fast, it's very easy to lose your audience quickly, because if you fall too fast, then you have nowhere else to go for the rest of the play, and you kind of bottom out. Unfortunately, I didn't feel that happened with this production that we watched. It was quite the opposite, actually, and I enjoyed watching, especially Lady Macbeth in this version, that slow descent, and then like you could feel it bending for most of the play, and then suddenly it just snapped. And
might I also say on top of that, Will, too, like with Kristen's usage of the language and the way she, at the beginning, even her breathing tactics and how that changed as the piece went on. And also, like, as actors too, knowing the release of vowels being a very emotional experience too. So when, you know, the guttural moments of her screams and squelches near the end, it just hit so much more. 100% was that spinning factor of, oh wow, this is totally different from when she started. And I feel a lot of that happened. I actually have a note of how the whole cast textually really weighted themselves with this piece, and I think that again plays to the psychological factor as well, because you know your mouth is doing exactly what the mind wants it to be doing. You know, it's another little playful tactic to be married with the physicality. And just talking about that gives me goosebumps, that I'm sure that marriage, you know, Brigit talking about terrifying audiences, I think that subconsciously you're not realizing, but it's that precise hit of the text paired with that physicality that just keeps that intensity, and also can show that the weighting factors of downfalls and stuff, like, you know, so.
Yeah, and the one thing I will say, I think, what I think was one of the things we have to continually watch is, especially for directors, is not being precious with the text, where this is the shortest play. I mean, Will, you and I took that Shakespeare class at York, where they talked about how this is one of the more challenging plays at them, with the folios trying to marry them all together. There's some discrepancies in there, and just the fact that this text, it's the shortest, so you got to keep that speed up. These characters, once that first murder happens, there should be no time for the audience or any other characters to breathe until you get to that tomorrow, because that's the moment where you can have that brief. But other than that, like, I've seen other productions, and I remember watching the Michael Fassbender film version, and for me, like, I got what they were going for with that psychological close-up internal monologue idea, but it was so slow. There was no drive to this piece, and that's the thing I loved about this piece, was it started off right away with that execution of that soldier, and then there was that great slow acceleration up to the murder of Duncan. And then once the murder of Duncan happened, it was the fastest plow through right to the intermission, and then you open with that murder of Macduff's whole family, so it just kicked you into that beat again right away. And I think that was something that did this production really well, was this is one of those plays where you don't want the audience to breathe too much or think. Like Hamlet, you can take your time, because Hamlet stops and thinks and he questions his world. Macbeth, Mackers, he especially like the idea of murdering Banquo, he's very quick on that moment, because he's decided that this is what's gonna happen. I'm gonna murder him, and then I gotta murder Macduff. Like he's very driven at that point. You need to drive that with the audience, where there's no downtime for them to sit.
I found even with Ian being the younger Mackers too, and this was in their interview as well. Ian and Kristen were talking with Antoni about how they're younger Mackers and Lady M's than some other productions, right? And so that was so interesting too, his take on the character and him physically being younger. He was so much more flippant and operating on instant gratification, that it almost, it spiraled the text faster than seeing an elderly Mackers, because there's more experience maybe with that type of Mackers, or the mental breakdown is a thing that's been boiling his whole life, whereas Ian's interpretation was so flippant that alone sort of drove the play, I found, in moments. And they also spoke about how being a younger generation, it kind of like hits on the theme of that in this play too. And I think that their relationships with the younger cast members in the show too, like Fleance and such, that again, that added another layer of goosebumps, because it was like there's a miscommunication between the generation of now, which is so relevant to today as well too. So
well, you were going to say something.
I mean, I'm kind of interested to hear what Brigit has to say about this, but I think I kind of disagree with you, Mac, about trying to barrel through everything like very quickly. I think there are some key moments in the play where the tension and the tempo and the rhythm of the piece pick up extremely, like to the nth degree. And then when those moments are absent in the play, there's a slow burn of energy where things almost seem to start to settle down. But then when that energy is reintroduced again, it's another big spike. And we get this constantly building energy that goes on throughout the entire piece. But I feel that it's spurred on by like one type of presence on the stage. And Brigit, I was just curious what your opinions were on the tempo of the piece in general, like what serves the piece well.
Not even just really about Macbeth, but I always feel like this is a good thing and a bad thing. The audiences at Stratford are so familiar with these pieces that if you pause too long, they'll finish the sentence for you. You talked about that, like we are saying lines that, are implanted in people's brains, these lines, they know these lines by heart. And if you pause too long, I don't know. I think most of the time, I'm not saying that I like to go really quickly personally as an actor, but I think you kind of have to keep the pace going. I think that the onus is on the actors to keep that narrative going. The audiences are usually way ahead of you.
Sorry, we'll go.
I was going to say, is like, I completely agree with you. Like the pacing of the piece has to keep up. I suppose what I'm saying is that I find, like, and this is maybe my own personal preference, is that the energy of the piece, in that speed that you're talking about, Mac, of like barreling through, I find whenever there's these abstract, spiritualistic, mystical elements of the play, is like that's when that peaks, the unknown, the terror, as you were talking about, Brigit. And then the characters rally from that terror and try to reground themselves in their realities. And that, what I guess what I'm getting at is that's where I feel the tension and that energy of the play of barreling forward could come from effectively, is that when Macbeth says, like, I must go see the three witches again, right? I feel that if you play on that factor of the witches and those mystical elements bringing in that level of barreling, that huge overpowering energy to the stage, that what you get at that moment is something truly horrifying for the audience, where everyone knows that this is a horrid decision. They're with Lady Macbeth and her absolute denial and rejection of this idea. because the energy is going to pick back up again, and the energy doesn't let up again until the very end of the play, after the trees have marched in and Macbeth is dead. And I guess that's what I'm getting at more, is that I think you need to pick and choose the moments that the energy spikes, but if the energy is consistent through the whole play, we can get a flat
lines. I was just about to say, it's like a heartbeat, right?
Which
it's the
I've seen
same
that.
tempo per se, but you just choose where you sandwich in what's the high peaks and the low peaks, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Like I don't mean just like rushing the text. I meant more just as a piece as a whole. There should be a faster heart rate than a Hamlet, which I feel is a much slower, a slower heartbeat instead. That's what I mean. Yeah. You don't want to rush the text, because Shakespeare with his punctuation and his phrasing builds in, as we know, following iambic pentameter, builds in natural ups and downs that you'll use. But overall, as a director of a piece, you should be wanting not the actors not to sit and do the to be or not to be. Like it should be like there should be that continual spurt of kicking the story forward down the road. But yeah, perfect. Okay, so we kind of touched on this a little bit, but our favorite design elements of the production, which is, there's so much to talk about in here. Brigit, since you worked on it, you kind of mentioned the sound and the lighting for you, but let's go deeper into that, because you were part of the creation process of this show. So what was it like working with those elements, and why did that kind of become your favorite?
Well, just that it really did set the mood, and it also allowed us to do some stage magic. So people still talk about the scene where the banquet table was here. So that was all done, not smoke and mirrors, but light and sound. I was part of the scene prior to that. And our sound designer talks about this in the morning talkback that we did, is that we did a scene down in one of the Voms where Fleance escaped. And so your eye as an audience member was drawn down into the Vom while the rest of the cast was bringing a massive table in, putting their seats down and starting a scene, all in very low light. So it was kind of the hero of the day, was the fact that we could create things out of nothing over somewhere else that was that in total darkness. So I think that a lot of that it's really difficult to achieve without the smoke and mirrors, the light and the sound. Even my possessed voice, which he talked about as well. Many attempts to get that otherworldliness quality that I had, a lot of different techniques. So for me, sound and light in that production were the stars. It was really, really critical to attaining that absolute terror.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. Will, how about you? What was your favorite production element of this?
Yeah, boy. That is a tough question, because there was a lot to enjoy, and it was a feast for the eyes and ears, to be sure. And I'm not just saying this because you're here, Brigit, but honestly, most of the times that I was blown away with the production's design elements was during the scenes with Three Witches. Specifically, one of the first moments when the third witch is walking onto the stage, and she's dressed in this black cloak that's draped down all around her, and all you see is this wooden staff moving across the stage, and the top is shrouded in darkness, right? It's like literally you see the figure of death slowly looming over the presence of the entire stage, which I thought right out the gate as the opening was like, oh yes, brilliant. Lovely stuff. And then like the shadow of death never disappeared again, because those shadows were present throughout the entire piece, which really adds to the point on the lighting, how isolating and terrifying that was. Just that the witch's presence was felt in every single scene because of the lighting, except for, interestingly, Macduff's house, which I don't know if that was intentional, but I certainly felt an interesting shift there. But
I wonder if we actually talked about introducing us in that scene and how we might serve, because we did spend a lot of time saying, how would we change this? But it did have a lightness to it, didn't it? And all the scenes, the lighting again saved that scene. It was bright and it was light, and it just had completely, it was a domestic scene, and we hadn't up to that point really seen anything like it.
Yeah. And it was the briefest moment of respite in the show, and I think we only have one other, is when Macduff goes to
Malcolm.
To Malcolm. Was the only other time that we had that brightness in the play, and it was such a beautiful contrast, because it made when we returned to the darkness, as an audience member, I felt like, oh, can we just maybe stay there just a few more seconds? But it was absolutely brilliantly done. Like I at first, the lighting, like as an audience member, obviously not quite sure what the production was going for yet, I was like, oh, that's like quite dim to start. And then as the play went on, I was like, I can't stop watching. Like, it's so focused and detailed on what we're supposed to be looking at the entire piece. So in terms of the mysticism elements of that, the other production, I'm sorry, I have like a couple that I really got to talk about.
Go for it.
So please interrupt me if I'm going on too long. One of the other pieces that I was like, oh, that's mind-bogglingly cool, was when Macbeth showed up at the witch's hut, and the visions were being shown to him, like the hands coming out of the cauldron with the images. I was like, oh, that's so brilliant. How have I not like seen this before? And like the smoke coming off of it. And also, Brigit, you were talking about the moment, like, look what I have, that there, like the smoke and mirrors element of like the like you guys' ability, like the sleight of hand play that was going on within this play just absolutely blew me away. Like it was one of those extra things that's like, oh, maybe they are magical. Like as I'm watching it, maybe there is actually a mystical element these characters and actors possess, because every moment with you three, when you just appeared out of the scene, like cheering at the end, right? And then you all three turn out to the audience. I was like, what? It's like these very small moments that, again, it's just that presence of this darkness that Lady Macbeth invites at the start of the play. Is just omnipresent throughout the entire piece because of the work that you three put in on the stage. It's mind-boggling. Mind-boggling.
For sure. Wonderful. Jill?
Yeah, that snowballs right into my thoughts. So I was a huge fan of the soundscape, as discussed. Just even the types too, like the animalistic sounds, the screeching, the like slow hums, like very subtly heard, but present, omnipresent, like Will was saying. So that definitely was a driving factor for me. But I think like the grotesqueness of this piece and the violence that like is established by the witches, but it just ripples again subtly, but just enough into all the other characters, to the point of like drop kicking Lady Macduff, who's actively pregnant, or like shanking young Macduff in the side. Like there was violence that the audience clearly was forced to see, but then there was violence that we weren't forced to see. And so there was a dialogue happening in my brain of like, oh my gosh, so you made me look at that, but then I didn't get to see certain, and again, with the scope of the camera, maybe these scenes were happening, like you said, Brigit, just by watching it via YouTube, we weren't able to see certain things happen. But that was so the whole discussion with violence in this play, I think was a huge kicker for me, because there were certain things that we were forced to see and maybe didn't want to see, and then other elements that I might have preferred to see but didn't have a chance to see. And then you have a scene where not only does Banquo's ghost come up, but also Duncan's. And so now you have that elaborate conversation going on, why are both of them there? This is cool that they are, the way that they look, how the blood is spewed on their costumes, how they're disfigured, it was, so even all the witches, like they're different embodiments of looking disheveled, or Lenny's being blind. Like there was so many different layers of grotesqueness, I think, that this piece offered, that you could just go on and on and on about close reading into it or discussing about it. And so I don't really know if that's a production element, Mac, but I guess
I would say so.
Grotesqueness in the stage combat and costume elements. And the soundscape is like a little cherry on top of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will almost certainly say the sound design was my favorite element. I remember being in the theater on opening night, watching the play, and just the atmosphere that soundscape created in that theater for 1,800 people was eerie. Like I remember watching the first time, Brigit, you have that possession voice come out of you. and everybody, because I was up in the balcony, but watching everybody's face in that moment, just do you could just watch them all.
She's like, I'm so sorry.
Crumple up, and it worked. It totally, and the same thing when like you're coughing up the thumb, that guttural Gollum-like sound you make that was there, and it's just there's that, and then also the same thing when you hear the shanking of Macduff's son, where it's not a quiet stab, like there you can clearly hear the lung being punctured. In his chest. Same thing with that opening scream by that one soldier getting axed at the top of the show, and the fact that they used exorcism sound bites that they talked about in the cast reunion was just something that I was like, oh, that's creepy. And then I think as I was watching this late one night, it was like 11 o'clock at night, and I was folding laundry, and I had this playing, and sure enough, I thought I heard something at my door, so I really had to go out and I had to check the door and make sure it was locked and okay, but it was that same type of, it created that eerie atmosphere. And the stage combat, I have to give a shout out to the stage combat, because that was something where once again, it was the pace of it. It was like Ian and the actor who played Macbeth, I can't remember.
Michael Blake,
Thank you. Yeah, Michael. Yeah, so the two of them, the fact they had that speed in their final fight, I remember watching the Calm Fior version, and in the program, because Stratford has those beautiful picture programs that I buy every time I go, and they had that great shot in the picture program of Colin Fior wielding 2 machetes, and it looked really badass and cool. And then you get to the fight, and the pace wasn't there. It was very, I don't want to say legato and slow, but I don't know if it was an off night for the actors doing the fight, or if there was something that happened right after the fall off the balcony, and they were being more safe with what they were doing, but there wasn't that speed and that energy that was needed for those fights, and that's what made this play feel almost like a Braveheart, Shakespearean Braveheart, which is what that Michael Fassbender version I think wanted to go for, but didn't quite hit. But in your production, totally hit that with all that great combat. Like there was just something so wonderfully. The whole Macduff execution scene was right out of the Red Wedding, where they stab the pregnant belly, and it was. I mean, I watched it, I was like. Oh.
I was just going to say, bringing the violence back to, again, modern depictions, and talking, Brigit saying, like, it's going to take a lot to terrify modern audiences, because quite frankly, they see these things on their screens now as kind of second nature, right? So again, it adds that relatability factor, for sure, which is just tying that back to our conversation earlier.
Yeah, perfect.
So I want to encourage people to look at the conversation between Greenblatt and Antoni, where he's talking about this play, and he's talking about his book Tyrant, and he talks about the fact that the tyrants are known for killing children. So talking about the attempt of killing Fleance, and it was it wasn't successful, but he does manage to murder all of Macduff's children. The tyrant will do that, right? So if you're going to do that for a modern audience, you have to go pretty far with that as well, because we see it every day on TV, because we see those kids, that are in detention in the United States. We see this all the time on social media, on the news. So to kill a child on stage, it has to be, again, unfortunately, riveting.
100%.
Absolutely. Okay.
Sorry.
Go on. No.
I just had one more quick thing.
Go.
Because it was along that sense of like death of family, in terms of that being a very jarring thing for an audience member to watch, because that's not something that is commonly seen in media nowadays. Game of Thrones excluded, obviously. But I thought that one of my favorite design elements, and I can't really say it's a design element as much of a casting choice, but I feel it falls under this subject matter, so I'm going to talk about it quickly, is making, and I don't think I could ever, if I were to work on this play, ever cast the play any differently now that I've seen it, is Banquo being much older than Macbeth, and there being that father-son dynamic there, and him being that voice of reason and conscience, and trying to veer Macbeth away, and all of these elements, so that when the guilt comes in, it's not so much of, this is my war brother, somebody that I fought with. Well, that's all there, and that's all very true. There's also this sense of, this was a father to me. like the weight that Macbeth carries with that as part of the guilt. And I think that created so much more dramatic tension than I think any other production I've seen of Macbeth, because almost always Banquo and Macbeth are relatively close in age, in the versions that I've seen of it, at least. And so there's never really been that father-son pull in terms of the tension between the characters.
That's another veil of that generational theme too in this piece as well, like having both Banquo and Duncan, and that scene having their ghosts sort of loom around the stage of young, like, hardy chaps. It has that weighing factor again too, right, of generations past, and what is right, what is wrong, and right from the get-go you see Banquo and Macbeth, by sheer physicality and age, they are from different generations, and they operate differently, and they feed into each other, but that in the end dissipates. And what does that mean? It just kind of adds another layer of discussion with this particular piece again too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of themes and ideas and motifs with this show, that gets into our next section, which is all about that, and just kind of the really kind of neat things you did. I'll kind of kick us off, because the one really cool kind of theme or motif I found that continually appeared throughout was that dagger sound. So after the dagger speak, there's that almost the knife sharpening, like the sound that kind of shows up, and it shows up during the final battle a whole bunch. It shows up kind of throughout all the murders, and there's little moments where you kind of can hear it in the background of that soundscape again. And I just found that kind of that great kind of foreshadowing omen of death. That it was the sound of death. It was the sound of stabbing, and the idea that it continually harkens back to this. I think that's almost like that continual high-pitched sound that Macbeth has to hear throughout the entire play after he commits his murder, is that non-stop kind of grating sound where sound is that very triggering memory thing. So the minute you establish that sound, that now the audience, even when they hear that, go, oh, murder, death. It's the same thing in The Godfather, where you have the idea of anybody who eats an oranges, it's going to be picked off next in the movie. It's that same type of thing. So that was one of the really neat themes, motifs that I found. Brigit, for you, having done the show, was there a particular motif or theme or symbolism you really wanted the audiences to pick up on and take away with them?
Not really. I'm probably the most boring person to answer this one. I often I don't see a play in a bigger world. I can see it from my viewpoint, but I think I think the thing that I will take away from it is the animal imagery, the ravens, the crows, the the gray malkin, and I remember that too when I did Lady M, that the calling up of things. There's just something, the animal stuff for me resonates, but it for me as a witch, the cat was my image, and that's so I guess I probably will always take away the animal imagery. That's very huge. And when you read the script, like there's that whole, I remember studying this in school, and our English teacher was really hard on hammering that fact, because there's the scene after Macbeth has been crowned, and they talk about the changing of the weather and the animals reacting, and there's something about the horses acting up. Like there's that whole concept of the animals representing the world not being right. There's something off. It's just like in real life when the animals can sense either an earthquake or a tornado or some type of anomaly that's coming, and they start getting away. Or you watch in all the horror movies when like there's a big tsunami coming, and you see all the birds fluttering away from the scene. It's that same type of concept. So the animals, yes, this plays great with and that tied great in with the set as well, with that concept of nature and animals. And that's something that I know Antoni talked about when they did that great conversation with the designer, Joanne, where they talked about how they where they came up with that, sitting out on the bench, watching the nature kind of around them and hearing that sound. So Jill, how about you? What type of theme or motif stood out to you in this?
So definitely, like Brigit was saying, the animalistic soundscape, I think, again, fed really into, as I said before, the lovely grotesqueness in sort of in your face some of these moments were. Like the contortions of people's bodies. And actually, in particular, this is quite specific. I guess it's probably not even a motif or a theme, but I noticed with people's physicalities, like Lady M, how do I even state this? Like, in the times of turmoil, or when a character was in distress, they found their way hunched over or more grounded or physically on the ground, like Macduff's sort of plea or frustration, sadness in regards to hearing of his family's death. He's like on his knees. Lady M crawling around quite physically. Obviously, the witches from the get-go are all over the place when it comes to contortion and being grounded. And then I don't remember seeing much of Ian being on the ground until at the very end, you see Macduff holding up his head. So quite literally, he was beheaded. And in that, now looking back at it, I was thinking, well, that was the moment that he fell or was on, so to me, I don't even know if this is a theme or motif, but I guess the physicality of being more in relationship to the ground when you're in distress, that I think that rings with me now that I'm kind of unpacking this as I'm saying this. So it's a lot of garbly goop is coming out of my mouth right now, but
that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, so ground. I take that how you want to take that.
Yeah, no, that's something now I want to go back and rewatch the play again just to watch that physicality, because once again it's that inner collapse.
Yes,
especially for Lady M, where it's that continual collapse into yourself. Macduff has that where he's on the ground, he's collapsed in, but then he has to rebuild and comes back as this leveled up guy ready to go take Macbeth's head off. And then and then you're right. I don't remember Ian ever being on the ground. Like even during the dagger speech, he's standing the whole time and reaching out. Like I remember when Colin Feore did this scene. He was on the ground leaping over tables. Like he was really energized with that moment, and Ian's stillness in that moment, just that steady beat that he had of driving forward and everybody else kind of falling around. And Brigit, you said when I was watching all the interviews, especially with the Witches Brew, where you talked about how your animal partner with the witch, yours was the cat. So you said there was a lot of spinal warm-up work, making sure you were there. And even watching your hair now with that character was kind of out and almost cat ear-like. It reminded me of the cat wigs from the musical Cats, where it was that big kind of out and kind of and then it really accented your eyes, making them that really big cat eye out to the audience. And just especially when you first do your first scene and you're just watching that very cat reflex moment. And then the second witch was a toad, and the third witch was a harpy. So having all those different animals and just watching your physicalities was really fascinating.
So maybe I guess in a nutshell, the rippling effect of the supernatural, which I don't necessarily know if you can sort of depict through just reading the text, but in seeing it, to me, that the theme of the eerie, the thrilling, the supernatural, that I think is where, that's where.
Well, that's fantastic. Will, how about you?
Well, I mean, there's a lot that I want to comment on that's already been said, but I'll do my best to bring up new facts or new things that I saw. I think one thing that was really interesting in terms of motifs and symbolism was parenthood that exists within this play, and specifically, I wrote this down as this note because I was like, I'm curious to know. Maybe Brigit can answer this. I don't know, but Lady Macbeth touches her stomach a lot during the scenes where she's calling on dark forces or pleading with something beyond herself for things to work. And it's interesting, the most touching I saw of the stomach area, that lower abdomen, is when she's inviting the dark forces to come and aid her and give her courage. And it almost communicates, to me, I just saw it's this deal with the devil type of mentalities of first child in exchange for power type of mentalities. And from that point on, she can't look back until it's already far too late, much later in the play, without Damn Spot. And I thought that was a really interesting, and again, I'm not sure if that was just the actor having an idiosyncrasy or a deliberate choice of the directing of the program or something that you were privy to knowledge-wise. But I always thought that out of everything that I saw in that production, that one was the one that gripped me pretty strongly, because we have all these other characters that very much embody parenthood in loving and responsible ways. You know, you have Banquo, you have Macduff, and even the king in his own way, Duncan, being a father to all the Thanes and everything like that. And, we have these examples of parenthood, and then like the only couple we really see struggling with parenthood, and in this version of the play, very specifically with like maybe the choice to struggle with parenthood or the lack thereof. And I don't know if there's something to that, or if I'm just looking way too much into this one gesture.
I guess I can't really answer for Kristen, but you know, Greenblatt talks about this as well, that, you know, what is the bargain? She basically, we know they've had a child because she says, I've given suck. But she seems to be making a pact with somebody, and she's asking to be unsexed. So in an odd way, well, it's odd that she's touching her womb or her stomach, but she's asking to be unsexed, because Greenblatt suggests that Lady M knows that her husband doesn't have the manliness to do the murder. So maybe she needs to change her sex and give up something to spur him on to do the murder. But you know, you'd have to ask Kristen that.
Fair enough.
but it's an interesting observation, that couple and the psychological connection that they have, that they agree to this, but she knows his limitations, and so she's willing to give up her sex to help him be the man he needs to be to do this. He also talks, interestingly enough, about how strong Macbeth is at the beginning. No, sorry, reverse. She is strong. She is sure. He is unsure. He is nervous. He you know, he's just met the witches. They're talking crap. He doesn't understand. Should he believe this stuff? But he writes to her. So she knows all the stuff he knows. He also points out that not many women could read. So she's a very unique female in canon, because she actually can read. So he writes the letter. So she has foreknowledge of what the witches have said. And she's sure, and he's, and then as the play goes on, he gains his confidence, and she, as we know, ends tragically. And they never meet. You think this couple's gonna meet somewhere in the middle? They're gonna get it together. They're gonna make the right decisions, and they don't. They just are seeing each other. So yeah. Well, I can't quite answer the question because I wasn't the actress doing that part, but it's just an interesting study of you know, a psyche. For those people, well, what were they should have been everything good together, and instead
it all falls apart.
Yeah.
Well, continue.
Well, thank you for the insights, Brigit. I wasn't sure if maybe you were privy to that knowledge or not, like if you were in the space while they were discussing it, because I know like it only ever happened when the dark forces were at play, and so I kept thinking to myself, like, this must be a deliberate choice.
Perhaps it was in reaction to watching rehearsals with Lady Macduff. I mean, maybe there was a mirroring of her holding the yet to be baby, and you know. The women in this play are very interesting. They not particularly in positive light. You know, you've got Lady M, who kind of incites murder. You've got three witches or Weird sisters who are basically fates that can determine what man does or what the future holds.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, as Michael Blake pointed out, about his relationship with his wife. We meet his wife, and she's super angry because he's not around. So it's these are interesting women in his canon. They're not typical. They're not particularly nurturing, and they're not particularly subservient. There's a whole bunch about these women that is very different. And then of course we've all seen the productions where not all the witches were female. So
that adds a new element altogether.
Some of them are men. So I don't. But anyway, regardless of gender, and we don't have to really delve into that too much. It's interesting, the play that Shakespeare wrote. That the three female presents are just, they're very different.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. All right. Will, are there any other themes or motifs you want to talk about, or you want to bring up? Is there anything else you want to dive into?
Not right off the top of my head, just in terms of this production in particular. There's some that I think are interesting in terms of the show itself, like the text itself. But that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. All right. So then let's move on to the next question, which is so this is once again a very well-performed play. There's many different recordings we have available, whether it's the Roman Polanski film, the Michael Fassbender film, we have the Ian McKellen version, Patrick Stewart version, we have this version. So why do we think that this particular version done by the Stratford Festival is the one to show people, and it's particularly students who we're introducing to the world of Shakespeare? Because a lot of times this is one of the first plays that students are introduced to, whether it's in grade 10, grade 11. It's one of these kind of plays that you really kind of get to know at a very young, informative age. So why don't we start? Brigid, do you want to lead this one off?
Well, simply I would say that if you're showing this to kids in Canadian schools, it's good just to hear people speak with Canadian accents. It's as simple as that for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't make it a better production. I just simply am trying to speak to the fact that to hear something, to see yourself, to hear yourself on stage, I think it's important. Even if it's just the video version of it, I think it's important for people to recognize themselves.
Yes.
So I'd say specifically, if it was Canadian schools, if it was a Canadian audience, that this would be a go-to.
Yes.
That alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that's in my notes as well, that especially particularly for Canadian schools, this is a really nice piece of Canadian theater that we have. And on top of that, I think out of all the versions, like the Patrick Stewart's very modern, you have the Ian McKellen and Judi Dench version, which is one that many people see. But it's nowadays, I think students may not connect with it as much due to being a very desaturated, almost black and white color, and the set's very minimal, so it's a lot of black backgrounds. But with this is such a vibrant production to show students, like if you want them to understand what this play is, and you really want to capture them, as you said, there's that haunting, scary element to it. There's the goriness and the violence that's really well done in this. And then on top of that, the time period that it's set in is the perfect time when you're trying to describe to the students what this play is. This is a great piece of theater that can really give everybody, even somebody who's not a big fan of Shakespeare, a way into this work in a really nice, organic way. And that's something, reason why I would definitely want to show this to anybody when I'm trying to explain what the heck this play is. I'm like, well, just watch this and you're totally going to understand where we're going with this. Jill, how about you?
Yeah, just to kind of bleed into that, I think like you're saying, if especially if this is being shown to kids who maybe aren't prone to Shakespeare or don't quite like it, by setting it in sort of a Globe Theatre-esque period, you're eliminating that other thought factor of it being in a different world or a different era. It's sort of setting the text, grounding the text in how it might have been seen or performed. So that might even create more of an understanding of the language, quite frankly, because it's sort of grounded in its origins, one might say. But then also just talking about what we've touched on throughout the night so far is, again, having a younger sort of glean on the cast, sort of what conversations will that spur, and showing them violence, you know, whether we like it or not. Youth nowadays, they're being exposed to violence that probably they shouldn't be, or loss of innocence is happening a lot younger than society would want. But so having them see that on stage too, in a way is an educational plot point in itself too, right? So I think, there's a lot of discussion for adolescents to have with this piece in particular, unpacking the text, but also unpacking the various themes that we've touched on tonight too.
Yeah, for sure. Is this one you're going to show your nephew, Jill?
I don't know, Brigit. I have an 18-month nephew who I've kind of taught him little Shakespearean quotes here and there. We do to be or not to be. That is the question. That's as far as we gotten with that monologue. But he's a little bard in training. Probably not anytime soon, but in the future, you know, if he's interested, I'll say, like, back in the day when the pandemic was going on.
Exactly. This is what it felt like to be part of a pandemic.
Exactly. Yes.
Exactly. That's perfect. Will, how about you? Why do you think this production would be a good one to show to students?
Well, and then I agree with everything that's already been said in terms of if the students were studious and interested in the content, which more often nowadays is the issue, is that a lot of these, the newer generations coming up now, and our generation certainly, and I know even my mother, who was speaking about this recently, their generation had a similar thing where you get some kids that are very passionate about the learning of Shakespeare and the study of the language and the meaning and interpretations of the plays. I think that's fantastic, but I think what would really grip a lot of younger audience members now about this performance in particular is the spectacle of it. I mean, the production quality is so high, and every aspect of it just blew me away. I don't think there was a single thing that I saw that felt underdone. Well, not being overcooked. I don't know if that is a relatable metaphor to anybody, but everything felt perfectly into the aesthetic of the entire mood and atmosphere of the play. And I think that if you're looking to catch a younger audience, specifically students, a lot of the time what they're looking for nowadays with all of these, and I'm a victim of this myself, with all these Marvel movies going on with the bright lights, flash of colors, is to bring those elements into something more grounded and dark. And I think that's probably why the witches scenes caught me so much, is because those spectacular elements that aren't seen in the everyday life are present there, and like everything to do with all of these spiritual and I keep using spiritual mystical, and I apologize for that, but these spiritual and mystical elements of this play just were absolutely like a treat and a meal for the eyes and ears. It was brilliant aesthetically, and I think that is why I would use this one. And then also I agree with Brigit, hearing Canadian voices speak these traditionally English lines, I think is quite an empowering thing for a younger audience who might be thinking about this themselves.
I think even just to add to, and going back to what Brigit was saying, of this piece being a great piece to show like the strength in women too, like for younger audiences, and especially saying that these sort of female characters aren't necessarily the stereotypical female Shakespearean characters per se. So I guess you could argue any production of Macbeth will show you that, but this one in particular, I think it would shed a lot of light and discussion on how, you know, women are perceived in today's society, and how sort of stripping away the beauty, you know, and kind of getting to the bare bones of the emotions and like naturalness of a woman. You know, it's not all corsets and you know, made up faces, you know, and so I think coming at it again, it would just add like another educational facet to all the things that we've discussed.
For sure. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So now we get into the next part of the episode, which is where we kind of do a bit more of a deep dive and we talk more textual play itself. We've gone into great, wonderful depth about the production. Now we're going to dive more into the textual play side of things. So our first question for this is Shakespeare's shortest tragedy in the canon. And do we think the length of this play either hinders or enhances the work? Because I know some people say the turns of these characters are really fast, whether it's the downfall of Lady M or some of the decision choices that are made by Macker's himself. There's a lot that this play moves at a very, as we talked about, a fast pace. And does the length of the play help this, or are we feeling that we wish we had one more scene with Lady M before she comes out for her out damn spot moment of the show? Will, we're going to start with you this time. So what
Sounds
do you
good.
think?
Personally, I think the length of the play itself enhances the piece overall. There are some things that I would maybe change in terms of if I were to stage it in order to give some of that light, especially to Lady Macbeth. I feel like she is very there's a disservice done to the character, I feel personally. Like I would have her appearing in more scenes, even as representative of the trouble sleeping and the psychological warfare that's going on within her mind. We see a lot of that with Macbeth through the text. That's obvious, but we don't really get a chance to watch that happen with Lady Macbeth, except for those breakdown scenes with the spot. So I would probably interlace that a little bit more into a staging of this piece. But overall, I feel that if this play was longer, we would get into that territory of audiences waiting a little bit too much. Things would slow down too much. If you were going to lengthen it, you'd have to have more of those spectacular elements that increase and ramp up the intensity of the piece. That's the only way I could see lengthening this piece as being justifiable or worthwhile.
Yeah, for sure. Brigit, what do you think?
No, I'm trying to remember discussions about why this is so short, and also the time frame of what happens in the play. I can't remember. Is it like, it feels like the first bit is like with 24 hours or something.
Yeah, basically, yeah, it is.
I remember, and I can't remember now of all the plays that I've done in the canon, do they all sort of happen in the same day or the same 24-hour period? Or it's fascinating to me, but I just think that it is, in and of itself, it's a one-off. It just is what it is. So we can say, Will, you can say that you'd like to see Lady M fleshed out more, but we have to remember too that Shakespeare wrote these roles for the young boys in his company. They weren't so they might have been doubling as someone else, right?
Right.
It does seem an injustice to the character, but at the same time, in terms of the acting company, they had to parse out these roles. And so I don't know if Fleance was Lady M. Like we don't know what the casting decisions were. But I think sometimes it's just that's just the way it is. I remember seeing and this is always talked about, that the Fool is also Cordelia, and I did see a production of that. Trying to remember the actress from England who did this. Emma. Hello, Thompson? Is that her name?
Yeah, Emma Thompson?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
She was in a production where I watched her do The Fool and Cordelia. So that, so I do think, the piece is what it is, and that's what it happens, just because it is such an unusual piece.
Yeah, for sure. Jill, what do you think?
So I would probably take up my rapport with William Shakespeare himself, but I'm a huge Macduff clan fan. Sorry, wow. Macduff clan fan. That's a tongue twister in itself. I find the characters of Lady Macduff and Macduff himself to be so fascinating. Like, I just want them to be unpacked more textually. They're not. They are, just the counter couple to Macker's and Lady M. And it would just be interesting, I guess, with the text at hand, maybe it would be like a directorial approach of making them more of a presence, or just kind of seeing how you can unpack them more. But yeah, like I personally would love to play either of those characters, like a gender bent Macduff or Lady Macduff. Because I find, yeah, like they are like a counter couple. There's a lot of counter couples in Shakespeare's works, but this one to me isn't fully flushed out, and I don't think they're supposed to be. By no means, I think, would it add anything significant to the text already written. So I guess it's just a personal preference of unpacking them. But otherwise, I agree with what's been said too. Like this piece is so striking as it is, and that's what fuels, you know, the text in the piece at hand. So yeah, it would be me going down my own Macduff rabbit hole, seeing what I could conjure up through unpacking those.
For sure. Well, I will say I think the length does enhance the work, because the shortness makes it accessible. It makes it one of Shakespeare's most accessible texts, particularly for the layman or for the person you're trying to introduce to the world of Shakespeare. This is such a great play to kick people off with, because it has the action, it's fast, and because it's so short, everybody can really kind of follow along, because the plot is so streamlined that there's very little else. Like the Porter scene is one of those few moments where that kind of falls more into that classical kind of Shakespeare spin-off moment where it's like that, oh, we're taking a bit of a Shakespearean left turn here, but then we're right back onto the main line again. So that's what I like about this length, is that it's compared to a Hamlet, which, I mean, Hamlet, it's one of the most well done, it's one of the most beautifully written plays, but giving that to someone like my sisters or my parents who aren't big Shakespeare fans, they look at that body of text and go, what am I doing with this? Like, this is just like that just shuts people down right away. But yet you give them this where you go, oh, okay, I get what they're going here with the unsex me now or the dagger speech. It's a very understandable bit of text. So yeah, I do think that the length is that nice, lean bit of Shakespeare that really helps modern audiences who may struggle with text understand, for sure. But yeah, fantastic. So the next question is the play is always, what is Lady M's role within this piece? Because people go back and forth on her all the time, and as Brigit pointed out, that when this was originally done, this was played by usually a young boy, and now this is a role that's been assumed by females. There's been some very famous females who have done this part. This role is being, especially once females took on this role, there's been a lot of scrutiny placed upon the females with their depictions of this. I can forget, there was one actress in like the late 1800s, early 1900s who was very powerful in this role, and male audience members were actually taken aback by her, first of all, her beauty with this long red braid that she wore, but then also just this physical presence she had on stage, that they were really kind of terrified of her. They thought she was quite like a witch, basically. They thought she was really hypnotizing the audience and really dangerous for male viewers to behold on stage. So Jill, why don't we start with you this time? What do you think about Lady Macbeth's role in this play? What do you think it is?
Well, I think, just speaking from like an actor point of view, and I guess character alone, that she's one of many female Shakespearean characters, but this one in particular, where you don't really know everything about her from the beginning of the piece, but then she sort of shows that to you in the words she chooses to say, or the things she chooses to act upon. And she does it in a very visceral and harsh way. In a sense, it's beastly. So almost from the very beginning, I don't really see her as a woman. I almost see her immediately as a facet of Mackers himself, almost being that little voice in the back of his head, or his conscience, or because, especially just using this production as a reference, Kristen's portrayal, she really did play back and forth of sort of the innocently guiding her husband towards the decisions that they would make, but then also telling him to make the decision, or essentially like slapping him in the face with her words. So personally, if I ever had the honor of playing Lady M, I think I would go at it like very harsh in a way, like beastly way, sort of basically humanizing the witches in a sense. But there definitely is, there's room, there's so much of her psyche to delve into. So I think at the end of the day, to me, she's just whatever Mackers lacks. She kind of fills in the gaps.
She's his foil.
Yeah, and that kind of makes her less of a person, but also more of one in the same sense, if that makes sense. Like she knows that she's manipulating, but in the same, I feel like she is being manipulated by her own thoughts. So all in all, it's like this, she's a tangent of Mackers. Whether she chooses to be that or she just is that is a whole nother thing to go into.
For sure. And then Brigit, you've played this part, so you've gotten the chance to tackle the part. So what do you think about what is Lady M's role within this play itself?
Well, I think that they are a unit. And I think that she has filled the gaps. What he lacks, maybe she doesn't even have, but she feels she has to provide that. And she's not unusual. I mean, I wasn't part of your Coriolanus discussion, but Volumnia, as the mother of Coriolanus, has to do exactly the same thing. She knows that her son is lacking in certain parts of his character that would make him a better senator or ruler. But so she makes herself, she pushes him, she wills herself to become the aspects of him that he doesn't possess and to spur him on. So it's not an unusual relationship, but it might be husband-wife and it might be mother-son. But they're not unlike in what they provide in these productions.
For sure. Wonderful. Will, what do you think? What do you think about Lady M's role within the play?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to be piggybacking a little bit off Brigit, if that's okay, Brigit. I agree, actually. Like, I think that you have to look at them as a unit. I mean, I always work in images and metaphor. Like, the way that I've always seen them is two puzzle pieces that complete the puzzle all in of themselves. Where Macbeth and Lady Macbeth definitely fill in each other's blank areas that, maybe they're lacking in, specifically Lady Macbeth. And it's funny because the traditional, like, masculine qualities that would be brought out within some of these more classical pieces of, like, drive, ambition, power, authority. It's interesting that Lady Macbeth fills in that role quite aggressively. And, like, it's also bouncing a little bit off of Jill's point about how Lady Macbeth in a way is a tangent, but Macbeth as well is also a tangent of Lady Macbeth. Separately, they aren't a force to be reckoned with, I don't feel. But together, they're one of the most terrifying pairings in all of or all of Shakespeare's canon. But it's because, like two puzzle pieces, they fit perfectly together, and they complete the image themselves. So I think if we're talking about what her role is within the play, it's to fulfill the picture of a psychological horror at the same time as a weirdly functional marriage.
It was in one of the videos that came out with the play where Antoni Cimolino was mentioning how they have like the most happy put together connected couple of the canon compared to everybody else in Shakespeare's canon, where the couples are kind of going all over the place and aren't connecting, even though they don't meet in the middle like we want them to. They're still
Sorry, I don't mean to cut in, but like with these two, there's no falsehoods. You know what I mean? They see each other completely bare for what they are, and they're and I think that is what makes them the functional couple they are, even though they're like the actions they commit are atrocious. There is something to be said about the fact they see each other as they are for their ambitions, their positive and negative qualities, and accept each other for those qualities and enhance those qualities, like the more positive qualities as they would see in each other. And I think that's a powerful thing in terms of anybody who's in a relationship.
There's an interesting part, though, spot in the play where he kind of leaves her behind, which I wonder now, in thinking about it, if that was the actual breaking point when he says, when he calls her by that nickname, which Greenblatt also pointed out, and that's very unusual in Shakespeare when he calls her Chuck.
Yeah.
That he basically dismisses her and says, be innocent of the knowledge. I got this. And I don't know, that might have just been the breakup right there. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's kind of sad now that I think of it. to sit there and watch it again, I think that would be really sad when he did that to her. I wonder if he was aware of it. Anyway.
Probably not in that moment.
To me, that scene was so interesting to watch too, Brigit, because to me, like, both Ian and Kristen exuded youth on stage, but to me, Kristen's presence was a bit more mature than Ian's was in their characterization of both their characters respectively. So when that happened, it was kind of like an awkward shift of power, because I still think she left necessarily, like, that moment with the upper hand, just by the way that Ian kind of delivered that speech, or the vibe he sort of gave to Kristen in that moment. So much so that after that scene in particular, I do see this particular Macbeth as just going off the rails, as opposed to like taking the bull by the horns and running with it and not needing Lady M anymore. It was just a really interesting interpretation for me, because I've seen little snippets of other productions where there is a total shift of power, and you kind of you're scared of Macbeth himself, and he's the one doing the deeds from there on after. But in this moment, it was like, no, I don't. I think he's just totally off the rails now. So that, and I think that what's lovely about this couple too is there is that dynamic that you can go back and forth between, like you were saying, Will, like Lady M is a tangent of Macker's, but vice versa as well. So it makes this couple so fascinating to delve into in that respect too.
Yeah. And for me, I'll just say, piggybacking on all this, I think Lady M, for her, I think she is the driving force of this play. Without Lady M, you don't have the play, because without her, I don't think Macbeth would ever kill Duncan. She is the catalyst for this whole story. When you look at the couple together as a pair, she is. I always look at her as the more ambitious one of the piece, and ultimately she kind of feeds into Macker's himself, where she kind of exudes this energy that he then picks up and kind of takes away from her, which was going to ties into them being the fool, and then also ties back into that great line of, for every strong man or strong male leader, there is a stronger female leader behind him that is being his driving support, and the minute he loses that backing, they're lost. There's something that they've lost their springboard. And for Lady M, I think she is definitely the springboard of this piece, where she's the continual sounding board for him. And the fact that she's also his connection to humanity and to the rest of the world, because once again, he's also a warrior. He's this driven a guy with a sword, and then she is the one that kind of has to bring him back into the rest of the living world. And then Ian did such a great moment of when she dies. It's her death that stops him again, because he's been on this almost foaming at the mouth path, driving forward with the witches and Macduff and the murder of his family. And then it's like she dies, and it's like he hits a wall. Basically, there's this wall that comes up, and it's almost like he dies right there on stage. And as you talked about, that tear that goes down during that tomorrow speech, it's just him dying, and basically they're one of those great couples where they die together. It's also the thing of now, like when we look at female serial killers and psychopaths, it's the whole thing of they need that male side, that male partner to kind of almost help unlock that side to them. And very much same thing with Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, where he kind of unlocks this for her, this drive, this ambition, this extra bit of murder passion that she has in her, where Ian and Kristen talked about, where like they didn't want to have this conversation or their characters never talked about murder before this moment. And the minute that letter comes, it unlocks that part of her where it's that, ooh, there's something's being unhinged in her now, where there's that bit of that extra bit of energy to her. I'm rambling a bit now, but yeah, Jill, I see you wanting to jump.
It would be interesting to explore Lady M and Macker's pre-loss of child too, or even pre-marriage. Like I that to me would be something that would be important to kind of explore in approaching this piece, because I think too, if we go back to the whole idea of parenthood and coupling, you know, they've together and separately have had to face the loss of themselves in some shape or form already, right? And lost the thing that would have maybe brought them together, right? So that's psychologically too, it would just that would change obviously the relationship, and then both introspectively as well. So just that feeding into each other, that would be something that would be definitely on the mind to unpack.
Wonderful. Yeah, perfect. Is there anything else you want to add to Lady M before we head into the final question of the episode? Or are we all ready to go for the final one? Because we're going to be timed back to where we started.
Final question. Let's do it.
The final question. That's right. So this play, as we talked about, deals with witchcraft and mysticism, and there's that extra element. But some people have said that element is dated. Like I've read some reviews and some critiques of the play where they go, in a modern setting, this doesn't quite work anymore. Audiences don't connect with this part of the play anymore. They call it, this is the part of the show that kind of loses people. But I mean, personally, I disagree with that. I think that this is the element that brings people back to the show, because it is the unknown element that we've never been able to fully figure out, with the idea of the curses and the magic in the witchcraft of this piece. There's something about that side of it that is the unknown that we want to discover, because that's one of the reasons why we watch horror movies on repeat. Why do we keep watching Halloween all these years after it's come out? It's because Michael Myers is this unknown force, and we want to figure him out. We want to understand. And the same thing with Frankenstein and Dracula. It's why these characters, once they're created, are so stuck in all our minds. Is because we don't want to be scared of them, but we are. There's that element of we want to understand and compute, but we can't. Brigit, I'll let you lead off next, since you played a witch.
Yeah.
I forget. Was there a question in there? That's
Yes, there is. So the question once again is, does the element of witchcraft in this play still work, or is this element of the play dated? Is this something that doesn't work anymore?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that question, because I so think it works. But just to elaborate also, Shakespeare was a brilliant businessman. He knew that James I believed in witches. He knew that he said the witches prevented him from returning to England with his new bride, that they created a storm at sea. That's why he was late. And that's the part where I was spewing about the pilot and the travel stop in storms and everything. I think at end of day, we probably don't have to think any further than that. The man was brilliant. He was writing a piece at a time when he knew James I would totally dig this thing. So,
absolutely.
A good businessman.
Yes.
I don't know. You've said this yourself, Mac. You would bring your parents, your family to see the Scotch play. So I think I've alluded to this before. If you give it the integrity, I believe personally our production had, yes, it's relevant.
Yes, absolutely. Will, I saw you smiling along with this question, so where do you want to go with this?
I think it's absolutely ludicrous to imagine that it's a dated element of the play. Like, people read horoscopes all the time still. The amount of people I can count in my close friends circle alone that are still into mysticism, do tarot card readings, are into astrology of all sorts. Like, mysticism is still well and alive and thriving today. And I find that there's often this dismissal factor on in the masses, because no one wants to say, it's like, oh yes, like I believe in horoscopes, like as like a public statement. But you know what, like a majority of people have the willingness to believe that there are powers beyond our mortal comprehension and understanding, and almost every day participate in some of these more mystical practices. I think if you're asking if the witchcraft of the play is still relevant today, I think in order to be relatable might be maybe the better question.
Okay, there you
is
go.
that you
Go
might
for
need
it.
a blend of modern mysticism with traditional ones, like Brigit was talking about earlier with the curse that the witches use. That does seem to be pulled from maybe something a little bit more archaic beyond Shakespeare's time. And I actually believe that too, because that one in particular is a very chilling line, like the series of lines to hear. So yes, I think maybe what makes it more relatable is the blending of the modern and archaic styles of mysticism, which is why I think your version, Brigit, went quite well, is because, you know, like you had the, I'm trying to remember the proper name for it, but like the stick figure of the man that you were all spinning around back and forth, and like you know, a lot of modern audiences are like, oh, Blair Witch, right? Like they connect with that
Oh my
immediately, and like
gosh.
then there's that click, right? And then you have them because it's not something abstract and unknown anymore. It's something relatable but still outside the realm of you know, comprehension per se. So no, I don't think it's a dated element at all. I think it's still extremely relevant.
Perfect.
That's all I have to say about that.
Wonderful. Jill, take it away.
Well, I find personally, I just relate to the witches the most out of all these characters, because they're just, again, I've said unpack and grotesque so many times in this discussion, but those are the words of the day. It's the eeriness, it's the grotesqueness, it's the no fear to conjure up these things, the feeling of energies and you know, pointing fingers where they need to be pointed, like all that stuff resonates with me just like as a person. So anytime, you know, seeing the witches in this production on stage is like, oh yeah, like we're back, I'm here. I saw more of myself as like a person and performer through the witches than I did the main plot of the whole piece. So yeah, it's because I think in a way, like they're the underbelly of all of humanity in some sense, whether that be like an ominous one or just like a kooky one. Like they show an element of, because quite frankly, yeah, they're witches, but they're still humans on stage or in the piece, you know, they're still characters. So they show that side of humanity, in quotations, that I think we all carry, or we all have, or we all maybe believe, or resides in us. And the fact that they just through text and physicality lay it all out, that it draws me in more than the plot itself. Yeah,
for sure. Wonderful.
I want to say in the time of the plague, aren't we all searching for, you know, that fortune cookie saying that comes to pass? Are we all trying to read the tea leaves? Are we all trying to figure out how we are going to navigate this next stretch of our lives?
Yeah.
And the thing about the witches ultimately is they didn't make him do this. They simply handed him the fortune cookie, and he was supposed to decide. He was the one that had to determine how he would receive the information and if he would do anything with it. So, you know, as much as being the Weird sisters who were in charge of, you know, directing the fates, we did nothing but present him with a piece of information. The rest, you know, it was his decision to make.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And Ian brings that up in his speech, where like, yes, he gets given the fortune cookie, but then his first idea is to jump to murder of Duncan. Like we all say, if he had just waited, then the plague probably would have come along and wiped out Malcolm and the other one.
He didn't have to do anything. And in the time of plague, none of us know who's going to succumb.
It's true.
So what was he doing? Why did he even have to go there? So it's an interesting question that Shakespeare posed in that play, in the time of plague, you know. You know, you actually ultimately might be in charge of your own fate. And then in times of plague, you might not. So,
yeah.
I love that note. I think that's the best note to end on. Brigit, thank you so much for coming on and doing this with us. Like, this was an absolute treat for me to reconnect with you.
Thanks for the Cup of Hemlock.
Yeah.
I won't be around for the next one because I'm having a Cup of Hemlock. But if you ever want to invite me back, please do.
Oh, we're definitely going to have you
Absolutely.
back. There's lots of great ones coming up. I mean, I hope we'll get to see your filmed version of Merry Wives of Windsor, because that was an absolute treat.
Yes, I keep the promises, but there's talk of that being released. Yes. Yeah.
Fantastic, yeah, because watching that, like watching you take on the role of Mistress Page this time around after doing it with you as Mistress Ford, there was something nice, and just the adaptation that Antoni did of this particular production worked really well. And then we'll see you already in The Tempest. We've seen you in Coriolanus.
Yes.
So that's 3 out of the 7, or 4 now, because Macker's as well. So Coriolanus.
You will not see me in Timon, and you won't see me in Hamlet.
Okay.
You won't see me in Love's Labour's Lost.
Mm-hmm.
I might not be around for a while.
Will we see you in R&J?
No. No. It'll be a while.
Well, Brigit, if there's any particular play you want to come back and talk about, then you're more than welcome. Just let me know which ones you want to come and talk on, and you are more than welcome to come back, because this was just an absolute treat. If people do want to follow you, though, on any of the socials and watch you and connect with you after watching this, what is the best way to do that?
Well, I'm on Instagram as Brigit Wilson.
Yep.
I'm on Twitter as Hoo Heart.
Okay. Love it. I love that. That's fantastic.
I'm on Facebook. I started Tumblr, didn't follow through on that.
Me neither.
I don't think I'll ever do TikTok. And
no.
And that's I'm around. I'm just sitting here in Stratford waiting for something.
Love it. I love it. Jill, where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram. My artist account is jillian.robinson96, and I am into singing and musicals as well, so you'll see an array of goofballness on that page for you. So
love it. Wonderful. And then Mr. William Bartley, where can people find you?
They can't. Is the short answer. I'm working on it. It's been made painfully clear to me how important having a social media presence is. It's something I veered away from a few years ago, but I'm working on it. You can find me on Facebook, Will Bartley.
Fantastic.
That's simple. That's what I got for you.
Great. And then you also can follow Cup of Hemlock on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We're doing all types of great stuff right now online, such as artist acknowledgments. So if you're an artist working on a project, or if there's a project you recently worked on that you want the rest of the Canadian arts community to see, send that to us at marketingcupofhemlock@gmail.com. Right, Will?
That's correct.
You can send it there, and we'll happily share that with the rest of our community. You can find me at Mackenzie Horner on all social media platforms. Just look for the guy with the ginger hair. That's basically it. You found me. You can follow me on my podcast, Before the Downbeat, where we talk about musicals. We just released Fiddler on the Roof, and we just revealed today that we will be covering Chicago next. And then we just crossed we're now almost up to 3,000 listens, and we just got new listeners in Latvia and Sweden. So there you go. Woo, we're basically on every continent except Antarctica. But we're working on that one. I'm sure there's a penguin.
Some penguins out there that want to listen to musical commentary for sure.
Yes. Well, we look forward to having everybody come back for our next episode, which will be all about Martha Henry's production of The Tempest. Keep your eyes out for Brigit in that production. And then we will. Yes, that's right. It's one of the wonderful little nips of the island. I loved it. It was a lot of fun picking you out on stage watching that production. And also the giant bird puppet is amazing to watch. That always blows me away. But definitely take a look at that, and we'll be back next week with The Tempest. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening.
Cheers, everyone.
We'll see you all soon. Cheers, everybody. Raise your glass. Yes. Drink the last bit. And fantastic.